You mentioned brain health a minute ago, and we ought to come on to that in relation to the rule changes that we've seen announced recently, Rob. We've had games now that have been played with those new rules being applied. Most people have said that there's been a lot of penalty counts have obviously gone up. But how do you see that working out? And obviously the the professional game, it's not until next season that we see those rules fully implemented. But how do you see it working?
I think we're all worried what's coming in terms of, because we don't know.
Yeah.
But actually, when you think about this in the real world of what's going to happen, it's always been illegal to hit the head and neck.
Yeah, sure.
What the data has always shown us is that the most dangerous tackles for both ball carrier and tackler, and that's in both the NRL and in Super League, where there's plenty of data, and even in rugby union, is when a ball carrier and a tackler stand upright each and they both coming together. That causes more concussive events than any of the others.
Because of heads clashing quite frequently.
Heads clashing, shoulders, and ultimately the game's played at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So a player runs in and he's always aiming to hit here. But when he's trying to aim and to hit here, it slips up and goes up. So a lot of our tackles are in this area. Referees, the data again shows that while we say head and neck contact's illegal, they hit about 10% of all head and neck contacts, whether that's because they were on the wrong side of it, they deemed it to not be forceful head contact, all the things that talk about black and white, not grey. So what we're actually wanting people to do is to hit 5 or 6 centimetres lower into actually where the good old-fashioned rugby league tackle was. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. It was 2-men tackles. We didn't have wrestle. Was the game? There was a lot more offloads. It was. Some would say. I would say it was a more exciting game. I actually think once players adjust a little bit and referees adjust, we're asking them to have more discretion in this area, but make the head and neck zero tolerant. Because if people aim 5 centimetres lower and they go up, they probably end up hitting here. Whereas at the minute they're aiming here and hitting here. So that's our challenge. How it's officiated, how it's coached is our next step. We've tried to educate the referees in terms of there are now discretions. So the tackle height trial was 80 penalties, but that wasn't a trial to find this rule out. It was a tackle height to understand what did it do for brain health. Now, what we're saying here is there are discretions. So if a ball carrier dips, and as long as there's no head contact, a referee can play on. If the third man in comes in passively and he hits the shoulder and wraps the ball, that should be play on from referees.
Sure.
What we're trying to do is get referees to put the shoulder area as discretion. Now, at the minute, they're not quite getting it right. The players aren't quite getting it right. Well, why? Because they've had 8 weeks to prepare for it. Let's see what this looks like in 12 months' time.
Exactly, yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's going to be a big adjustment period, and it might take that first season for clubs and players to really learn. I just wonder, in instances where a dummy half is scooting from hooker, to score a try on the line, do you think there'll be a little bit of leverage there if a player is just literally trying
exactly?
To...
So there are some already areas of discretion for the refs. So, and I keep describing it as like a 2-metre perimeter around the pitch because fullbacks dive out the in-goal area to get out. Dummy half scoots, players diving over to score, surrendering not to go into touch. So there is a discretion there for referees. They shouldn't be penalising those areas. And rugby union has the pick and go kind of mentality. If somebody scoots and he's unnaturally high, all we're asking tacklers to do is have bent a little bit. We're just asking 2 things: for tacklers to make an effort and for them to try and aim a little bit lower. That's all we're asking for. And let's improve our tackle technique and do some work on this. And that needs to be done by us as well as players.
Just talking about tackle technique though, Rob, I think you will probably agree that young players, it's important for them to learn tackle technique, effective tackle technique and proper tackle technique as early as possible, which seems to be contradicted by the idea that young kids should play tackle-free rugby. I mean, there's been a lot of controversy about this, and I'm not quite sure where we are with it, actually, at the moment, because there was that petition, and it's been reconsidered, hasn't it? But in my view, and going back even to when I was a kid, kids tackling each other, I used to think that that they're too small to really hurt each other very much. At the age of 6, 7, that sort of age, and the advantage of learning how to tackle properly at that age is that it will stick with them. There's nothing worse than having to learn how to tackle properly when you're a late teenager, because then you're unlikely to get it right, at least in the short term. So I just wonder whether it is why I just don't really think that it's a good thing to stop little kids learning how to tackle, because apart from anything else, young kids love tackling each other. You watch a group of young kids, and one of the draws of rugby for them, rugby league in particular, is that they're able to sort of wrestle each other and have fun doing it.
Yeah, I hear that. Just to clear up where we are, in 2024, under sixes won't be able to tackle; they'll go to touch. In 2025, that will be sixes and sevens, and in 2026, that will be 6s, 7s, and 8s. Then in the year after that, they'll become under 9s. That's when tackling comes back in. So there is a phased introduction of tackling. Part of the reason for that, Martyn, is this: that, and I coached my son, and I watch a lot of coaching that goes on at other age groups. I've watched my son play at 7. What actually happens is they don't tackle properly. People say they teach them to tackle properly, but they haven't got the motor neurological skill set ready, and the body isn't developed enough to learn to tackle appropriately. So they can learn certain parts of the skill. So linked to that 6, 7 and 8s is we're doing a project with a university and with coaches to work out what is the tackle curriculum for rugby league. How do you teach a person to tackle correctly? And we have all the stuff that's on the coaching courses, but there needs to be more about that. And so we'll have a phased introduction of contact over a number of years. And that might be, at under 6s, the big sausage tackle bags, diving into them and getting used to falling onto the floor.
Sure.
There could be some of that. And then at under 7s, that might move on to something else, and then on to under 8s. But at the minute, what actually can happen is a 6-year-old boy can turn up to train on Thursday, sign up with his club and play on Saturday, and be expected to tackle. And for all people keep saying, what about the big kid? That's the throwback, is the big kid. How does he go on? What about the little kid? What about everybody? Let's actually grow the sport. We lose a lot of kids because of contact. Let's introduce them to it.
Yeah, I can see the logic in that. But is there much evidence that very young kids do get badly hurt at playing rugby league?
So two things on that. There's a report that says 70% of concussions seen in Australia in children are caused by collision sports. So actually that tells you that's people who are going to hospital with them. That might not be a lot of numbers, but that's 70% are actually from a contact sport.
Right.
That's in the Senate report that was released last year. But secondly, this is also about the brain develop. We don't know a lot about the brain yet. We're starting to learn a lot more about that. And that's why a lot of our changes are coming, because the science and the medical knowledge now around brain health and what causes incidents and injuries and illnesses is starting to be really better known through CTE examinations post-mortem, because that's when you can only find out that you've got CTE at the minute. And understanding what the impact of a concussion on a brain is, because it is a traumatic brain injury. That's now its definition. So a concussion in a brain that's developing is, according to the doctors, far more dangerous than one that's in an adult of my age, at 40-odd.
Right.
So we have to protect younger people from that. And secondly, the longer you play a collision sport, the data now tells us, the more at risk you will be, and there's plenty of studies from other sports that show that.
The problem is, though, Rob, that the ultimate logic of that position is that we should ban collision sports altogether, isn't it? Because if collision sports are causing that much damage, potentially, then why allow them?
Well, everything in life comes with risk.
Of course, yes.
And what you have to do, and that's, again, part back to the recommendations around education and understanding, is that we can all choose to do anything. We walk out of here today, walk to the main road, we could get knocked over. There's a building site around here, something could fall off the roof and hit us. So there's risk in everything we do in life, and people have to be able to make informed decisions about that level of risk. What we have to do as a governing body, and the game has to sort of accept, is we have to give all the players enough information that says, Look, there is a risk to playing this sport, but there's plenty of benefits to playing a collision sport.
Yes,
Rugby league is one of
the point.
It's a fantastic sport. We do a lot of talk around social impact and reaching hard to reach areas. We would all know players who, but for rugby league, would have taken the wrong path in life. We have to remember that and balance that.
And there's nothing sadder, in my view, than meeting a former player, some of whom might have been my heroes, who were suffering from dementia. But of course, what you can't do necessarily is link the dementia somebody suffers in their 80s from what they were doing in their 20s. That connection is not yet provable, is it, as far as I'm concerned?
And that's right. And just because you can't say, I played rugby league, I've got a brain injury. There's a big piece of work to do beyond that.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of things behind why you might get a dementia, whether that be family history, alcohol, drugs, your daily life, working on computers. There's lots of things that contribute to all those kinds of illnesses.
And the thing that's
people living longer is the other thing,
that's right.
We didn't know how many people may have had this.
And the thing that's quite interesting is that you might have two different individuals going through the same process of suffering head trauma, and it might affect one of them far more than it does the other, because people's brains, at the end of the day, are quite individual. There's the structure of the brain and so on. One guy's brain might rattle much more than another. I'll give you one example from another sport, because I do quite enjoy watching boxing. Sometimes feel quite guilty about that, because of the nature of that sport. But one guy who was very famous, who was the world heavyweight champion in the 1930s, was Max Schmeling, the German boxer, who had two incredible fights with Joe Louis. You may or may not, if you're interested in boxing, know that. But Max Schmeling was born in 1906 and died in 2005 at the age of 99. And by all accounts had no dementia or ill effects from a very long boxing career, and in fact became an extremely successful German businessman after the Second World War. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that somebody going, in those days when he was a fighter, the rules, it was far less regulated than it is today. There were no real health checks. You would have thought that and Joe Louis, sadly, he did suffer from dementia, and Max Schmeling paid for much of his later care in Joe Louis's later life. But, why is it that some people can experience that sort of trauma and apparently not be affected by it, and others can't? It's just not yet explicable, is it?
And this is such a fast-moving area. We are moving along with the data and science as we learn about it, because that's what we have to do. When we know something, we'll act upon it. And that's why when people say about this being about a claim that's been made, we couldn't know in 1970 all that we know in 2023. We're trying to advance our regulations based on the technology and the science that's there. And an example of that would be concussion spotters. We now have found a way of being able to put every game on television, put concussion spotters at games, and see the benefit of that and work out whether that works. So this will be iterative. You've got to remember that. Some of these things might change.
So we'll be seeing more players brought off the field because of concussion that's been spotted by a concussion spotter, but which wasn't actually obvious on the field at the time.
Yeah, so we rely heavily over the last few years on doctors seeing it. Now, there could be a reason why the doctor might not have seen it, and they had pitch side replay for the last couple of years where they could go back and have a look, but a doctor might be treating somebody else. Someone might run across them as someone makes it. So it's an added fail-safe. I think we will see slightly more players come off the field this year, but that's a good thing for us. We shouldn't be sorry that we're actually trying to protect the players that play this sport. I really think that's a positive of it.
Two things, though, from what we've said. Do you think we ought to have more players on the bench to compensate for more players coming off the field? I mean, obviously, we've got 18 players now, but the 18th man can only come on in certain circumstances, but that's been eased, hasn't it, for this season? And secondly, how much longer do you think we can have a 10-metre defensive line? Because you've already said that, most concussions arise from collisions. Well, if players are 20 metres apart, by the time they clash, they're going at full speed, aren't they? And, I mean, I was watching the other day the 1966 Cup final, and you saw far fewer high-speed collisions in that game than in a modern game, because the defensive line in that game was 3 yards, not 10 metres. And so by the time the players came into contact, in most cases, they hadn't built up the speed that we see today.
Yeah, and I think you've seen that in the NRL rule change around the kickoff.
Yeah.
And our trial also looked at a kickoff at a different position. And what we actually found in the trial was a lot of clubs started to go short on kickoffs, because it helped in terms of trying to get the ball. So that we'll look at all those kinds of things. In terms of your 10-metre question, at the minute the data doesn't suggest that we need to change that. What we have to remember is we have to have a commercial product that people want to play, coach, referee, watch, pay money to be involved in. And that's why, look, tackle height will see a change to the sport. Will it change? I think it gives us some great opportunities, actually.
Yeah.
I think it will bring back a lot more skillful issue without getting rid of all the without getting rid of all the big hits that people say it'll get rid of. I watched the Gladiators with my son and daughter last week, and there was a game in that where a person picks a ball out of a pot and has to run to get it into the middle and put it in another pot. And some of the hits were monstrous hits. They never went anywhere near the head. They just hit low and drove. What we've actually done over the last 20 years, because of wrestle, in my opinion, is we've introduced an era of players who believe the best way to tackle is upright.
Yes,
you
that's
go back
right.
to the days when pre-wrestle, players just used to drive through people, and you try and offload when a player went right through the middle of you. It doesn't happen, does it, very often? And I think there's an opportunity to make better skilled players in this country, a more attractive sport that will actually see better tries. The Rangi chase flick round the back and stuff.
Yeah.
The offloading prop. We don't have many offloading props anymore, do we? Perhaps they'll come back.
I even think about how much it changed from when I played junior rugby league. My first year was in 2006. I was under 8s, and we were always, told, tackle around the legs, you can't run without legs. And then by about under 12s, under 13s, it was, all right, 2 defenders go high, wrestle for a bit, and then the third man in chops the legs, and that way we can slow down the ruck. And yeah, I thought it was interesting you mentioned that. It almost seems like since that wrestling came in, we're seeing more and more concussions. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see. And just another point I want to make about juniors, with the tackling. Back home, we often have a big size difference between some of the Islander boys that will move over and play. You'll be playing under 8s and feel like you're playing against a 13 or a 14-year-old just because of how quickly they grow and how big they are. So we do see a lot of juniors often shy away from playing football because of that heavy contact. But yeah, there's always been that argument: should we make it a weight-based juniors system?
I think that's a compelling argument, actually.
Yeah, so it's I guess it's different by country too. But you're always going to have that big boy playing in your competition and for different teams. So
and they have the under 15s in Australia now. Is tackle height is below the armpit.
Yeah.
So actually, some of these changes are already in Australia, and they have a safe play code, which is something we had only up to under 11. So you're right, and I like the argument around weight-based or something like that. I actually think what we're trying to look at is we allow players to play up an age group for operational reasons. What our review will be in 24 is how many players play up a year. Should players be able to play up or down a year depending on specific reasons for... I don't want to use performance, but for performance reasons, as in, is it right that a child who is 12 years of age but significantly bigger than the rest of his 12-year-old colleagues, would it be better for them to play an age group up because they would get more skill and improvement in them by playing at that level?
Well, that's it. It also stunts their development as well, because if they're constantly running through, scoring 5 and 6 tries every game, and then all of a
Against
sudden...
little kids, they
get to 14, 15, and all the kids sort of equal out, it's like they're going to fall behind because they haven't had that competition week in and week out. So, yeah, very interesting point you made there. In terms of, I guess, the new rules are being tested this year, aren't they, in some of the lower grades? So, it'd be interesting to measure,
Well, it'd be interesting to meet Rob again, wouldn't it, at the end of the season?
12
and
months,
just to see how it's gone, because obviously there'll be a lot of analysis of this season, weren't there?
Huge. That's what this is all about. It's about learning from what we find out at all levels, and part of the reason behind not bringing it in at the professional level was we've done some other things in that level where longer bans, harsher sentences on the field, send-off sin-bins, that might have an impact, and we're making every player wear mouth guards so we can understand what the data tells us about, is it the 10-metre impact? Is it... We know that head-on-heads cause the biggest impacts, but we might be able to do some things, and then we'll plot our course every year. The Brain Health Committee will continue to meet. It will operationalise all of these recommendations, because this is about stepped, proportionate change to ensure the long-term health of players in the game.
And also, obviously, there's the threat of legal action, isn't there, from former players? And I'm not quite sure where that's up to. I think it's much more advanced in rugby union, isn't it? They've actually, as I understand it, commenced legal proceedings. But again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that's not happened yet in our sport, I don't think.
No, that we have got a claim that's active within our sport.
Oh, we have, right.
We're slightly behind the rugby union claim. I can't go into too much detail on that at the minute.
But how many players have added their name to that? Can you tell us that?
I think I can. There's approximately 160 in the claim currently.
Really? Crikey.
And they range from playing age range from 1970 to 2023.
Really? Gosh, right.
Wow. Yeah,
gosh, that's quite daunting, isn't it?
I guess it's probably something that all contact sports are facing, and obviously the NFL's gone through it as well, and they're working hard. But I guess the best thing we can do is try and mitigate it going forward and learn from.
So what's the process from now on? I mean, you say you've received the claim. Presumably, they're claiming with a view to going to law, to a trial at some stage. Rob, what's the process?
Yeah, well,
you're obviously a lawyer as well.
It'd be a podcast in itself to talk about the legal process of a claim like this. It probably is worth. We can't say too much at this stage because it's only at the embryonic stage. But it will basically be case managed in the High Court by a senior master judge who'll case manage that. They make some decisions around whether the rugby league claim is separate to the rugby union and the football claims, which are all ongoing and all on public record as ongoing. But what we'll do is we'll respond to that appropriately through the courts. I don't think it's right for us to litigate this. I think two things on it though are, look, anybody who has suffered a brain injury, we have huge sympathy for. We believe we can successfully defend this claim because it's based upon a legal test of duty of care. We can only know what we knew at the time, but our changes now are not about anything to do with that claim. They're actually about protecting future claims, because what you know now is what you're assessed against for people who are playing now. What we knew in 1970 is what will be assessed against in those claims for that era.
And one of the problems that the RFL faces is getting insurance, isn't it, for players? I think in your last accounts that were lodged at Company's House, the cost of insurance doubled, or virtually doubled. Is that likely to happen again? Because it's imposing an enormous burden on the governing body, I would have said.
It's got a bit of an alarm going off at the moment.
Insurance is always a factor. In some ways, it's the most important factor for the sport, because without insurance, there can be no sport. That's what you have to remember that. But the good thing from our perspective is, and it's well broadcast, the issues that the sport faced in 2021, the year of a World Cup and how things were going to happen, and then into 2022, and again, what was a delayed World Cup. But we secured what we believe to be a long-term partner for the sport in terms of insuring it. They are actively involved in our brain health matters. We meet with them regularly. We update them with where the sport is going. They know what's happening in other sports, because one of the other legal tests is, were you acting reasonably like other governing bodies were? And they are very pleased with everything that we're doing to mitigate the risks that are associated with the sport. We'll never eliminate those risks, Martyn. That's the thing I keep saying. No. You can't make the sport 100% safe. But what we can do is we can react to what we find out, and we can make proportionate changes that will allow the sport to continue long term. And I think they're on board with that so far, but I'll touch wood. Yes,
but so you think the insurance costs will stabilise, in other words? Because
I think they'll stabilise. I'm not sure whether they'll ever reduce, because my car insurance has just gone up again.
Me too. And the most you can hope for is stabilising, isn't it? Not reducing, I'm afraid. But just coming on to one other thing, Rob, just going away from those issues at the moment. The other obviously controversial thing over the last few months has been the IMG grading system. And obviously the RFL's got a long-term relationship with IMG, and it's got another more than 10 years to run. So how do you see? I mean, and obviously, we've had an impassioned statement from David Hughes last week, criticising the grading system from the point of view of his club and lamenting the fact that the Broncos will probably be relegated come what may this year. And I'm surprised really that the system wasn't sort of slightly amended so that wasn't something that was inevitably going to happen. Because it does seem to take away from the competition when you know that, if the Broncos, got up into 5th or 6th position, they'd still be going down at the end of it. I mean, everybody must be hoping, I think, that they finish 12th so that it, looks as it normally does. But, how do you see this going?
So grading was something that was brought in. It's one of the key recommendations from IMG. Remember, it's a 12-year partnership, so it's about long-term success of clubs, because if we don't have successful big clubs and more of them, the product actually will suffer going forward. So this isn't about what 2024 and 25 might look like. Remember that partnership extends beyond 2030. So if grading's allowed time to settle in and grow and develop roots, and it ultimately, I remember when it first came in, the vast majority of people were saying this is a sensible criteria for a top level club to play our sport. What then happened was everybody got the reality of their grading scores. It got 90% of support at council after 2 meetings on the specific grading criteria and after 6 months of consultation. It dealt with over 270 data points and narrowed those down into the grading criteria we've got. And it established what we believe to be what would be an excellent club. The good thing for us was we established we had 7 excellent clubs, and actually we can grow that further. Now, dealing with the London point specifically, that is acceptably, it's an anomaly of this particular year. But actually, this is about not just being very good on the field. It's about being a very good club that's financially sustainable, that's able to attract commercial partners for itself and the sport, and grow the fan base. Because if we don't grow the fan base and we don't grow the viewing figures, ultimately, why doesn't somebody want to invest in your sport from outside it? Sport can't just keep saying, hand my hand out, I want some money, I've got 12 clubs. They have to add value to the partner that they're coming in with.
That's a wonderful thing to say, Rob, and nobody would contradict it. But at the end of the day, one of the places we need to grow support for the game is London. And we're not likely to see that happen this season, at least, given the current grading system. It is an anomaly in a sense, as you say, but nonetheless, it's an anomaly that should have been anticipated, in my view. Even if it was just to say that any Grade B club could be relegated, so those 7 might have been protected, as you say, and some of those 7 getting a Grade A is a bit dubious in my mind, but nonetheless, let's assume that it's perfectly correct. But the other 5 who are going to be in Super League next year, who are Grade B, including London, in my view, unless they can get up to Grade A in the interim period, by the end of this year, they should be capable of being relegated, just as London are. And that would at least then make it competitive, wouldn't it?
It would. I pardon the phrase, but this could be some of the growing pains of getting the right clubs to the right level. I get your point on London. I'll come back to London specifically. Yeah. London's massively important for us. It has to be massive for us from a community basis, from a growing the game basis. There's a lot, actually, of Antipodeans living in London, isn't there, in Western London, around Brentford. But London Broncos as a club have moved around regularly. Yeah. I remember refereeing there at Griffin Park. In fact, my first ever professional game was reserve at Griffin Park for London in Stuart Cummins' final game. There was a huge crowd there then. Their crowds over the last few years, and I accept the points raised by David around COVID, but how much off the field have they been doing to grow that? And how much, by the way, there's some responsibility on us as a governing body to do some of this.
And the thing is, you can't underestimate how difficult it is in London to promote rugby league. It's got such a low profile in the capital city. But again, coming back to the gradings thing, this thing about that London Broncos catchment area is the London Borough of Martyn. No, pull the other one, for goodness sake. That is absolutely ridiculous, and should have been picked up very early. The whole thing about catchment area as being as part of the gradings, particularly, for example, in Kirklees, you probably now have Huddersfield, Dewsbury and Batley sharing the total population of Kirklees, Wigan and Leeds sharing the population of the Wigan Metropolitan Borough, so Wigan can never get a full 20 points no matter what they do. That just is stupid. It's not. But it really just doesn't
Catchment
make
got
sense.
amended though, Martyn. Catchment went from being 2 points for where you were based to involving your community foundation.
But
there's a full point available for that.
You can draw fans from any area. I mean, I'll give you one example. If you watch, I take a great interest in college football in the United States, and one of my favourite team is. We're running out of time. No, right. Okay. My favourite team is Clemson, which is a city in South Carolina. Well, not a city, a small town that's the size of Featherston in South Carolina, but probably doesn't have the large population around Featherston that there is in West Yorkshire. Clemson has a population of about 16,000. Its average crowd this last season was 81,000. But if they'd been graded on this system, they would have said your catchment areas, Clemson, and maybe 40,000 people or something. Teams can draw fans from anywhere, really. Wigan, for example, can draw fans from the whole of Lancashire going north of Wigan, from Bolton and goodness knows where. Similarly, Castleford could draw fans from North Yorkshire, where I happen to live now. So it just doesn't make any sense for me at all. And the trouble is, when you have a system that doesn't make sense in one specific area, I tend to think that it probably might not make sense in other areas that I'm probably less knowledgeable about. It's a bit like this Horizon computer system, isn't it, that with the post office. Once you got into it, it was a load of garbage, unfortunately, and it cost a lot of people their livelihoods. Obviously, not that I'm not saying this is that serious, but nonetheless, you've got to be very sceptical about things that computers spew out.
Yeah, I'd accept that, but it's a very well resourced, not just on a computer, but an analytical basis of people looking at that. It's based around a lot of experience in sport. Catchment might be one area, and look, there is still a piece of work that's been ongoing by the RFL reviewing what came out on the back of the last one. I was going to say, presumably it's capable of being amended. It's not going forward. It won't necessarily always be the same. Yeah, so the RFL met with the clubs in December and discussed that further. Ultimately, we shouldn't always... Rugby League has a bad history of twisting at the first issue that arises, and it's done it in a load of different areas. And this is why we've sometimes got to say this is about long-term strategy, not about accepting there was an issue in one specific issue. And I'm not going to go back into catchment. I think you've made and articulated your point very, very well. But this is about the long-term health of the sport, and we have to stick on the course and keep going forward. Do we have to have a look at that and make sure we tweak it and we get it right? Absolutely. And facilities is an area I look after in the game now. There's a couple of little changes that have come into facilities this next time, because the TV deal and the broadcast deal is very different to what it was when we started grading. So if we need to make change, I'm sure we will, but we'll always do that in consultation with our clubs and ultimately with the long-term aim of the destiny of this, which is what we want. 12 Grade A clubs, then 14. With the ultimate aim is to grow fans, players and spectators, wider spectators, to the sport. And if we do that, we survive. If we don't, we'll be the next Kodak.
Yes, I suppose we will. But and as I say, those are very noble sentiments, and obviously I completely agree with them. But I mean, going back to IMG, what's quite interesting is that what IMG recommended, you've accepted fully in relation to grading, but you've not accepted in relation to reducing the length of the season and doing away with the Magic Weekend. So obviously, what IMG recommend, you don't necessarily have to put into practice, as you've shown in those two areas. So I'm just curious to know why grading was accepted, and as you say, there was an amendment to the grading system. I accept that in relation to what you've said about catchment and so on. But nonetheless, you've accepted them more or less as they presented in grading, but not in those two other areas. Why not in those two other areas as well? Why do we still have the Magic Weekend, and why have we not reduced the length of the season?
And some of those questions really probably aren't for me, but I'll answer a little bit of where I can. Grading was produced over a long period of time with a lot of input from Rugby League Commercial and the RFL to get to where we got to, and the clubs, by the way. It changed its iterations before the model was approved at Council. In terms of the other two recommendations, the sport had to make some decisions late last year because the TV deal and the broadcast announcements were not fully done, and we had to accept that clubs also, who are very important stakeholders, and actually club owners, who are probably the most important stakeholders because their money is on the line, we have to listen to their views as well. That doesn't mean that we won't look at the season length. Indeed, it's actually impinged in the brain health recommendations to look at that. So one of the easiest ways to reduce player load is to play less games, and the NRL does that fantastically well. But we have to get that right. Now, could we eventually end up at 14 clubs if we've got 14 Grade A's with 26 fixtures, potentially? With Magic, I think Magic will be quite an exciting time, actually, at Ellen Road this year. It'll be the first time it's been in West Yorkshire. It's closer to the heartland. When we had it in Manchester, we got great day crowds.
Yeah.
We should be seeking it as an opportunity to have a really great Magic, and I'm sure the clubs they'll deliver a great product for us again. But some of these things are all about getting them right for the sport each year, and then we've now got 3 years of certainty in terms of a broadcast cycle. Some of the great things that IMG have been involved in, that we've delivered a really good digital footprint. The Super League Plus app that's come about this week, the announcement from Vuno around the fantasy football app, the fantasy rugby app. Some of this is all the start of that journey.
Yes.
Let's not all remember that it's all front-footed from IMG. They are a partner of the sport, but the RFL will govern it. Rugby League Commercial will grow it commercially, and will use IMG's expertise and their review. Will review their recommendations, a lot of which were designed to come in 2025, and they will come in 2025.
And what are IMG getting out of it, Rob? Because, when we had the initial press conference back in 2022, we were told that their return would be based purely on any enhanced revenues that come in from broadcasting, sponsorship and so on. But it seems that they are getting a quite significant income from Rugby League apart from that. What can you tell us about that?
I don't know the full commercial relationship with IMG. I wasn't in my role at the time when it was negotiated and done, and I'll leave that for other people to answer. But in terms of what are they doing for the sport, we have a number of members of staff who IMG have brought around to us and making us better digitally and making us better in terms of
their biggest influence, hasn't it? The digital presentation on the part of clubs.
And I watch the NFL, and the NFL is huge digitally. My son does not watch Sky Sports for the NFL. He watches it on TikTok, on YouTube, through his Xbox. He watches it in 5-minute clips, because ultimately that's the next generation of fan. Now he's 12,
yes,
and all his generation are watching all these things through that. I was at a meeting with RL Commercial last year where a gentleman presented on something that the NFL use and golf use, where within 5 minutes of a round going out, a piece of software that shows the highlights from a specific game. They're the areas where we will grow the game digitally, and IMG are making big changes and assisting RL Commercial to do that.
And can you monetize that? That's the point.
Yes, that's the whole point about it. And the future might not be linear broadcast, It might be streaming, it might be clips, it might be digital footprint.
Young kids now, though, are growing up thinking life is a series of highlights, aren't they, really? That's really weird when you think about that, and how that will impact upon them psychologically as they grow older.
And that's why I think we've got an opportunity, because we're so good in local communities, getting young kids into grounds, getting them on the field at half-time beforehand like they do at a lot of the Super League and even Championship clubs, being there for a game. There's nothing like being at live sport, and you'll never replicate that. You can try and have virtual footage, I watch a lot of TV, but there's nothing quite like. I was at Oldham on Sunday, 1,500 people in a crowd watching an engaging game of rugby league. It still does have something that you can touch and feel, which digital won't do.
Yeah.
But by touching people digitally, they'll know it's on, they'll be able to go to it, and you can be smarter in how you market those people.
Yes, well, hopefully so.
Yeah,
just ask you one other thing as well, a more sort of, in a sense, a wider question. I mean, I take great interest in the way sports govern themselves throughout the world. I look at AFL in Australia, which is an extremely successful competition. Obviously, the NRL, the NFL, college football, but one of I think the most, over the last almost 30 years, the most successful competition in the world has been Major League Soccer, which has been fantastic, really, because they started in 1996 with 10 teams, which was coincidentally the same year that Super League started with 12. We've still got 12 teams 28 years later. They've now got about 30 teams playing Major League Soccer. And it's not because soccer is that popular in the United States, although it's obviously growing in popularity. It's because they got the structure right of their organisation right at the very start, and they made the competition the primary focus, and all the clubs, in effect, are subsidiaries of that competition, and don't have the rights that our clubs have, which is effectively to stymie proposals that come from the centre. In other words, the centre rules and the clubs obey in that competition. The clubs, the centre negotiates all the salaries for players. The centre can allocate players to clubs where it wants to. So that, for example, if we had that system and you decided that you wanted a successful club in London Broncos, you would be able to, as a central governing body, to make sure that they had a squad that could be successful. And I can't see that ever happening in our sport, because David Hughes has ploughed, people say, 20-odd million pounds over the years since he took control of that club. And yet, they're still not really up there as we'd like them to be. And I just wonder ultimately whether we've got to look harder at the actual structure of our game to create a structure. And as I say, I would model it on Major League Soccer if I ran this game. To actually, have because at one time I used to be a university lecturer in business organisation and finance, and I always used to say to students that you can succeed with a bad structure. It's perfectly possible to do that. But if you've got the right structure, then the right structure can almost guarantee success. And I don't think we have, and I think a lot of sports don't have in this country. Rugby union's shown that as well, incidentally, with so many clubs going under. So I know it's a sort of philosophical question in a way that you can't answer very easily, but I just wonder whether ultimately we need an equivalent organisation to IMG to look at the structure of the game.
Possibly that might be an interesting project to work on the governance structure of the sport. I don't think it's all about the governance structure. I'd love to hear your lecture on it. I think it'd be really interesting. I think we've already seen a few shifts in that sand recently. The realignment of the sport with Rugby League Commercial, having an independent board about driving revenue. Now, ultimately, the success of that board will be how big the sport is in 3, 5, 10 years' time. Where I think you've already seen one thing that we've done, we've moved away from allowing marquee players to just be players. We've actually said that the players, in order to be marquee, now have to commit to a plan to be grown as stars of our sport, because I think we'd all say we need more stars.
Oh, no doubt about it.
Getting stars these days isn't as easy as it once was. It's not about getting on Question of Sport or something like that, because people find stars in different ways. But we need to be able to use those players in the right ways and go away from the days of these clubs are in the grand final, you can't plead to their players because all they're doing is training. Actually, no, you need to be at the events. You need to be going to the media
That's
events.
why you ought to have a 2-week gap between the semis and the grand final, to give them the first week to be a media week.
I would definitely be with you on that one.
Yeah,
We're pushing an open door.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we've taken up enough of your time today, Rob, mate. Really appreciate it coming on. You've given us a lot of good insight as to what we're in for over the next 12 to 24 months. We won't miss the opportunity also to give the YouTube and the TikTok accounts a quick plug after our discussion about digital. So if our viewers or listeners are tuning in right now, make sure you go and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Total Rugby League. You can also head along to www.totalrl.com.
Buy League Express. It's a great product this week, as always.
That's right.
Like to say.
Head along.
But I am a bit biased on that regard.
Yeah, that's all right.
Thanks for having me. It's been really good. Thank you.
No, awesome, Rob. And all the best for your future endeavours, mate. Hope it all goes well. And I guess, Martyn, you and I will be back to do this next week.
Yes, I think we will, yeah.
Maybe not here, back in the office.
Back in the office, perhaps, yeah.
Andy's probably doesn't want to see our faces for a few more weeks. All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening. And we'll tune in next week. Cheers.
Thank you.